Good evening. My name is Reggie Delarm, and I'm a potter. I've been doing pottery since high school, so that's over 40 years now. And I've been doing yellowware for about 30 years. Now, people have been making pottery for about 18,000 years or more. And somebody probably just realized that if you put this sticky mud in the fire, it'll get hard and melt, and then it was very useful for cooking and storing in. Let's see, there are so many types of pottery that we would be here for months if we talked about all the different types of pottery. So we're just going to focus on New England. And the historical pottery of New England is mostly redware. The English, when they came into Boston area, the clay that was available to them was red clay. And there's a reason for that, and I'll get into that later on. But they knew how to make things out of red clay because they had red clay in England. And so the people that first came here in the 1600s, they needed pots to cook in and bake in and store their food in, keep the mice out of their corn, things like that. Interestingly, dinnerware was not very popular until the Victorian times. People didn't use pottery for dishes. They didn't have matching sets like cups and plates and saucers like we do now. Most of their pottery was just very useful. It was to cook in and bake in, drink in, maybe some pitchers, bowls to mix in. So let's see, the other early potters in New England would come into New Amsterdam, which of course is now New York, and the Dutch and the English that came in there would use the clay that was available to them there. There was a lot of red clay there, and there's a lot of yellow clays in that area. And we'll get into the reasons why we didn't start using yellow and stoneware clay in a minute. But the other New England pottery was the Pennsylvania pottery. And again, that was the German and the Dutch. And when they started making pottery, they did a lot of the redware, which is a lot like this that you've seen. They did a lot of writing, like this. And in the Boston area, they did not do the writing. They were not German, they were English. They did this boring, blasé redware with blotches on it. And they used the red clay that was available. They used manganese to make them brown, and copper that would make green blotches. And then they used lead glazes, which would bring out the color of the red clay. So, let's see. The other type of historical pottery in New England is the stoneware. Now, stoneware was more valuable because stoneware was a harder type of clay. It was, the different types of clay range from reds up through yellow clays and up into white, and then the porcelain. Porcelain is not really an original clay. Porcelain is a white clay, a white earthenware clay, and the potters have put extra silica sand in it to make it harder, so that's why it looks more like glass. But the clays themselves are very common. They're everywhere. The mostly white clays that have been contaminated by other things. And the reason for the red clay is that there's a lot of iron in the ground here. So there's so much iron, and you know how rust is. If you get rust on things, it stains. It's the same thing with the ground. So the clay in our whole area has all this iron in it. The clay is always going to be red. The clay that we did have available for stoneware, which is a buff clay, is in New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio. It has a lot less iron in it. And because it has less iron in it, fires to a harder density. And then it's better to use for storing whiskey and pickles. If you store things for too long in redware containers, it evaporates. So you really needed the stoneware to hold those liquids. The problem is we don't have any stoneware clays here in New England. So the first potteries that started making stoneware clays were up in Boston area, and that was in the 1700s, and they had tried making some stoneware from clay on Martha's Vineyard, and it didn't work. It melted. It must have had impurities in it from being out near the ocean, that it just didn't hold up well. So the whole stoneware production here in New England stopped until the 1800s. And the reason for that was because of the French and Indian War. The ships were needed for the war, and clay was not easy to transport. You couldn't just put it out on your cart and drive it around. To get it anywhere, you had to take it on ships, and you would bring it up the shore. So the early potters were all along the shore, Connecticut River, and so they just stopped making it until the 1800s. Yellowware is actually a type of stoneware clay, but it's fired lower than stoneware. It's kind of transitionary. And I have some samples here of different types of clay, and you can see in the ground, and even when these are wet, they all look about the same. This is actually going to fire yellow, and this one here is going to fire red, and that one's a white clay. So they all look basically the same in the ground, and a potter would just go out, dig up some clay, and see what happens. And you fire it up, and you can see it's going to be red. You know what temperature to fire it at. You know what glazes to put on it. Yellowware. Yellowware actually started in England in the 1600s. And back in England, they had a very crude type of yellow clay that they used, even maybe 1200s, 1300s. And they were using this crude yellow clay to make mostly baking dishes and serving pieces, sometimes jugs and mugs. They weren't into glazing back then either, so whatever they used it for was not for holding water. And so when the British first came to America, they wanted to make stoneware, this yellowware, because they were used to making it, but we had no clay. So when they first started making yellowware in America, it wasn't until the 1800s when they started making the stoneware. So let's see. Yellow clay is characterized by its yellow color. And this is actually the color of the clay. It varies. You can see this old bowl here is a lot darker. It could be from age. It could be the temperature in the kiln. It could be the atmosphere in the kiln, whether there was wood, what type of wood was used in the kiln, how long it was fired. There's a lot of different reasons why the yellowware comes out in different colors. And if you have any at home, you could see it. It's all different shades. The other problem with yellowware is that it darkens with age. So when people have a nice piece of really old mustard, this is the one they like, this mustardy color, and they say, well, can you make me something like that? It's not going to happen because, like I said, the clay is going to vary every time you fire it differently, different temperatures. There's just so many different variables, and the clay itself doesn't always come out the same. Even in the same clay pit, you can get clay from the same clay pit one year, and the next year it's going to be totally different color. So it gets to be a real problem, and that's why you're going to see so many different colors. Let's see. So in early England, in the 1200s, and you could come up and look at the pictures later because they're kind of small, but you could see some samples of really early yellow clay pottery and what they were used for. Like I said, mostly storage and drinking. In America, when we did start making pottery in the early 1800s, it was also at a time when we were starting to do industrial thing. The Industrial Revolution was starting to happen. So there weren't a lot of small yellow potters. It was like a few years before people were making a little pottery in their own little shops until they went into the big factories. And that's why, again, you'll see all the yellowware that we have made in America is very simple and very crude. It was made by unskilled laborers. The scalloped edges, these were done in a mold, actually, and you would take a lump of clay and you'd put it in a plaster mold, and you would pull down a lever and it would form the inside and press the clay against the edges, and that's why you see they're all the same. So it's a transitional pottery in the fact that it's between the red clay and the stoneware clay in hardness, but also because it was that transition from being small potteries, small local potteries, into the big factories where they produced hundreds of thousands of these pots. Most of the potteries in the United States were out in Ohio. Somewhere I have here, I think it's in here. This is actually a kiln that's in Ohio. It's still there. There are no big potteries out there now. There's Hall, and they do some whiteware, but there's not a lot of big potteries anymore. And see, this information here is about Ohio, because they had a lot of, not only did they have a lot of natural yellow clays to use, but they had a lot of gas to use for the kiln. People were also switching over from wood to gas firing. And there she is. So I think that's about it. And then I'm going to take some questions. Mocha. We could talk a little bit about mocha. Mocha is this big mysterious thing with yellowware. People say there's mocha ware. Well, mocha ware is originally this feathering pattern, this feather here. And it's called dendritic because dendritic means branching out like a tree. And the design is actually made by putting on a band of white clay, and then you make an infusion of tobacco juice and colored oxides, and you brush it on and it will shoot out like that. It's a chemical reaction between the very alkaline white clay and the very acidic tobacco juice. But nowadays, if you want mocha ware, it could be here, this pattern here. There's a little tree pattern or a little leaf pattern on this one. That's also considered mocha ware. A lot of banded ware is still considered mocha ware, but mocha ware was originally the feathery pattern. And I guess I'll take questions. Yes.
So the feathery pattern is not something that you design. It just happens?
It happens. It's hard to control sometimes. It's like using vinegar. It gets thick and globby after a while, and you have to do it really fast, and you have to do it while everything's wet. So there's a trick to it, but it kind of does what it wants, and there's certain days when it doesn't do anything. It'll just sit there. So it's a little...
So you blow on it?
No, that won't help.
But does it have to be tobacco?
I'm on videotape. No, it could be. People used to use urine.
Oh.
And people have used vinegar. I've tried vinegar, and it doesn't work as well. The best thing is tobacco juice. And pipe tobacco doesn't work either. You have to get cigarettes because it needs a dry, there's too many oils or something in a pipe tobacco. So you have to use a dry tobacco to make the tea out of it.
Do you have to chew it yourself, or could you put it in
No, you make a cup of tea with it. And I used to collect cigarette butts when I first started out about 30 years ago, but now I just buy a pack of cigarettes. And I could last, a pack of cigarettes lasts about a year. It doesn't take very much.
They're beautiful.
Now, on the top of this is, it's yellow clay. I have a small kiln that's only maybe 30 inches deep, and things on the bottom are not as hot as things on the top, even in a small kiln. And you can actually tell the difference between shades, just between the bottom and the top. So that's why you'll see my pottery, there's a little bit variation. And it also has to do with different batches of clay that will be a little bit different. Sometimes I fire things with kids' pottery inside that has newspaper in it, and that's burning carbon, so that's going to have an effect on it too. And then Hal has a clear glaze on the top. They used to use lead a lot. Somewhere along the line, I think it was around 1200 in England, they noticed that if you put lead with silica sand, it will actually flow better, and it will lower the melting point. So that's why they used lead. And they used a lot. A lot of it was 50%, 30% lead on their glazes. You could also use an alkaline, a borax, to lower the melting point and increase the flowing of the glaze. So that's what most people use now is a borax. It's much safer.
How did you do the brown and white one?
This one here, this one. This is just actually that's a glaze. It's manganese, and if you put manganese in a clear glaze, it'll turn brown like that, and it'll blotchy and it'll run. It doesn't flow as nice as the old ones because there is no lead in this one. The lead actually was so nice to use because it flowed beautifully. The borax doesn't flow as well.
I have a silly question.
Yeah.
How do you get the white band in the middle of the yellow ware?
Well,
that is
somewhere,
different?
and Pam, I needed a key,
Oh, you do?
but that's okay. If you come up here later, you can see me doing it, right here. I have to do it on a lathe. You put the bowl sideways, because of course gravity is going to pull that white slip right off the pot. So you have to do it sideways. You put it on with slip trailers, which are these little jars, and you fill them with liquid white clay, and you just squeeze it on. You turn that pot, and when the white band is on, you have to work really quickly because it dries really quickly, and it starts to sink into the pot right away. Once it starts drying, that glue isn't going to happen. It's just going to sit there. So you have to do it really quickly. While it's still wet, you take a brush, you dip it into your tea, and you just brush on the pattern. The trick is to get both sides because they all have a pattern on the other side. But by the time you get to the other side, it's starting to dry. So you have to work really fast.
It almost looks Asian,
It does.
like that one on top.
Yeah.
Looks like a dragon.
Yeah, they start to look like things. Trees, dragons, reflections on lakes. Yes.
It's so interesting to hear someone talk about technique and the level of skill and precision that's necessary before you can actually start to make the art. So you get the craft down first, and then the art follows. And that's one of the things that strikes me that's so wonderful about pottery is that it does bridge that area between the utilitarian object and an artistic form. But when you're talking about the lathe, did you, before I came in, I'm sorry I was late, but did you describe your wheel at all? You said that your kiln is rather small, but is your wheel electric?
Well, I do use an electric wheel because it's so much faster, but I have an old treadle wheel that was made like the 1800s, and you have to pedal it as you work, and it goes very, very slow. And there's drawbacks to going very slow. It's harder to center. Clay looks really soft, but once you've got it on a wheel and you have to center it into the middle just to start, if you don't center it, you're never going to make a pot. So you have to center it, and it takes a lot of strength to do that. Well, when you're using a foot-powered wheel, it takes a lot more strength. So it's almost exhausting. And once it gets centered, things kind of calm down a little bit, but it's still harder to do because you have to move your hands in accordance with the speed of the wheel. If you move your hands too fast, you're just going to get a lot of ridges, so you have to slow everything down. So it takes a lot longer. I would say it takes about 5 times longer to make things on that than it does an electric wheel.
But that must be just a sense of feel after a while that you know.
It is much nicer
Yeah.
because it's quieter and you're more in tune with the pot.
Mhm.
When you have an electric wheel, and even new people, when they first start taking pottery, they crank up that wheel, they think speed is better. And it is, but once you get used to that, you're making things so fast that you're just in a production. Whereas when you go back down to using a foot-powered wheel and doing it the easy, slow way, you just relax and you're being more in touch with your pot.
Does the electric wheel have different speeds?
Yes, it does, but you tend not to use the slow speed. You tend to do things faster because you have to make production.
Yeah.
You have to make stuff, so. But that was interesting what you said about the years of experience, because I work with a lot of other craftspeople, and we all talk about this, is that it's really hard nowadays to make a living at this. But the problem is, if you don't do it constantly, you don't get good at it. You forget. And even over the winter, I'm not going to be using my treadle wheel. So by spring, it's already like you first start it up and it's like, you know. So if you don't do things all the time, you lose that. You lose that touch. And the old craftsmen, which we like to call tradesmen, because it was actually a trade. You had to have pottery. You couldn't go to Walmart and TJ Maxx to get pottery, and Tupperware wasn't in existence. You had to go to your potter. So there were actual jobs for potters, and you would apprentice with a potter when you were very young. Sometimes 7 years old, you'd start practicing, and it was a very family-oriented. You would work for your father, your uncle, your grandfather. It was a lot of family. And once you learned how to do it, you would move, you would go to another area and start up your own pottery. So it took years and years of experience, though, until you were good at it. And you had to do it every day. And you did everything. You pugged your own clay. You dug your own clay. You pugged your own clay. You
What's
wedged
pugged?
it. Pugged? Pug is, it's mixing it up, because when you get clay from the ground, it's not usually in great shape. Usually it has sticks and stones in it. And you have to dry it, put it in a bucket of water and soak it until it's a sludge. And what they used to use is horsepower to mix it up. And they did this down at Williamsburg, if you had gone to see the brick making. They mix it up with a horse, they turn it around in a bucket and make it into a slurry. And all the heavy material will fall to the bottom, and all the sticks and grass and stuff will come to the top. And then you take out the inside, the middle clay. And that's what you're going to use, because it's cleaner. You can use clay with sticks and rocks in it, because it ends up happening anyway. But if you look at old pottery and you see a little ping on the edge, a little pit, it's usually because there was something in there. And when the clay is in the kiln, it's melting and it's compressing. And when it hits a rock especially, it will pop. Sometimes your whole pot will explode, but a lot of times it'll be near the surface, so just a little ding will fall off of it. It's kind of annoying when you're making a pot and you come across a little rock, and sometimes you ignore it, and sometimes you dig it out, and sometimes you have to start over.
Have you ever gone out and dug your own clay and started from
Sometimes.
Yeah. Where have you found it?
Well, Mandy brought me some from her. Was that your well that you were digging, or something up at the cottage you were digging and you found some clay? And friends brought some down from Vermont. When I'm at shows, which is really fun, I do a lot of shows in state fairs, and you'll get local people, and they always say, "Oh, I've got some clay in my yard." Well, yeah, we all do. So they'll bring me in some clay. And this summer, I was out in New York State near Erie, and these two little boys had their cows there, and they kept coming over every day, hanging around. And then one day they said, "We have clay in our yard, we'll go get you some." And they were back in like 10 minutes. And they had this blob of this really green, foul-looking clay. And I still don't know what it is. I actually screened it and made a couple little cups for them, but I haven't fired it yet, so I don't know what it is. And like I said, they all look the same. When they're in the ground, you can't really tell. If you're around here, you know that chances are it's going to be red. It's probably about 95% chance it's going to be red clay. But and Erie, New York, it could be buff clay. I don't know yet. And it had a lot of green organic matter in it. But it is kind of interesting, and I've made some pots out of the clay at Dog Pond, but I didn't screen that well, and there's a lot of sand in there, so you get a very mottled, it's red clay, but there's a lot of little white stones in it.
So I can understand how a stone in one pot could perhaps jeopardize that pot, but could it ricochet around the kiln and take out a few other
What
Objects?
usually happens is it explodes with a lot of force, and, oh, here it is. This is how you stack a kiln, and you stack them with wadding. There's a little piece of clay that you put in between them when they're glazed. Red ware was usually glazed raw. You'd make the pot, you dry it, and you'd dip it in glaze, and you'd fire it once. And then they had to put these little wads of clay that you see between the pots so they wouldn't stick to each other. And if you look at really old red ware, you'll see there's little marks on the rims and on the foot. It's from the wadding to keep them separated. So if a pot down near the bottom explodes, everything on top of it's going to go. And I actually have a lot of cool examples of that, where things have fallen and they all stick together. And the kids love to hear this. I make a lot of little pots, little miniature pots, and there's so many that I make that at a fair I'll make 500-800 of these things. And so I've gotten to the point where I don't really care anymore. I just throw them around in the kiln. And a lot of times they'll hit each other, and it's called kissing, because if they're too close to each other, they could be about that far apart sometimes, and depending on the thickness of your glaze, the glaze will jump from one pot to another and they'll connect. So you can open your kiln and find a bunch of little things stuck together.
Like
And it
barnacles.
happens with bigger pots, but less often with bigger pots.
When you see an accident like that, does that ever prompt you to think about,
Getting a different job.
No, I was thinking actually quite the opposite. No, I was thinking about, does it ever spark your interest to do something that is in a regular shape or an unusual form?
No, you don't want to do that.
You don't want to do that?
No,
Okay.
no. It's not usually a good thing.
Oh, okay.
No, and actually Sturbridge still fires their big wood kiln. Must have a picture of that somewhere. Maybe not. Sturbridge has, I think it's in here either. Sturbridge still has maybe a 30-foot red brick kiln that they fire with wood, and they fire it twice a year. And it happens a lot that pots will fall down upon themselves. Yeah. It's a beehive kiln. It's like this one here, only not quite as big. It's a lot shorter, about maybe half that size. But no, it's something that you don't want to happen, but it does.
How long does it take to fire a piece?
It depends on the clay and what you want it to look like and what type of kiln you have. A wood kiln takes about 36 hours and you have to constantly load it. And at Sturbridge they'll have shifts because you have to constantly stoke that thing with wood to keep the temperature up. It's once you get, and the Indians fired, well, we'll go back to the Indians because it's very simple. They would take their pots and they would heat them up, put them in a pit, and they would build a teepee of wood around it and light that. But you can't let drafts in, so as soon as that fire starts burning down, they have to keep putting more wood on because you have to get that temperature up to 1,000 degrees without air getting in. And so somebody constantly has to be there to load it. And a electric kiln, that takes usually about 8-10 hours. Depends on your kiln, how hard you want your pots, what you're going to do with it. There's a lot of variations. And then it takes that much time to cool off again. So once you fire your pot, you're really not going to see it for a couple days. It's always like Christmas though when you open a kiln. It's like surprise. No matter how well you formulate your glazes and how long you've practiced, there's always things that go wrong or things that are surprisingly nice. And sometimes you'll formulate a glaze and you won't remember how it happened, or it could have been an accident because you'll never be able to do it again.
So did you learn how to throw pots, or did you teach yourself?
Well, I learned in Regional 7 high school. I did that instead of math and English. So I did it in high school. I went to college for graphic design, but I did some pottery there. So there I learned how to do glaze calculations, which once you get out on your own, you just ignore all that stuff anyway. Because it's, like I said, it's, glaze calculations are a lot of fun. And I try to get my students to formulate their own glazes, but most of the time they like to go buy theirs already mixed up. But when you formulate your own, you learn more. You learn, glaze is basically glass. It's silica sand. It melts at a much higher temperature than any of your pottery, so you have to lower that temperature with the flux, which is borax or lead. And then you have to do all kinds of other things to it. There's things you could put in it to make it not so shiny, matte finished. There's things you could do to color it. There's things that will make it rough. There's a lot of different things going on. And the colors are never the same. It doesn't matter what you do. The blues are never, they usually look gray when you put it in, and blue when they come out, so you never know what it's going to look like. And like I said, and you have to measure things by grams, so in the old days they didn't even do that. They just used handfuls, so it's a risky business. Cobalt, this is actually cobalt, which was interesting because I actually finally looked up the price of cobalt lately. Cobalt is a mineral, and it's now up to $40 a pound, which is really high. I think last year it was $30, but it's up to $40 a pound now. But it's very, very potent, so you hardly use any at all. You just need a little bit. Whereas some of the other things, like the chrome that's in here, and iron oxide, of course, is like $2 a pound. So there's a big difference. So even though cobalt is in a lot of pottery, if you ever see Flow Blue, and the Delarm plates with the little bunnies running around on it, there's a lot of blue, a lot of different styles of historic blue pottery, and it's all just cobalt oxide, which is very, very common and very expensive.
So where do you sell all this pottery?
Well, mostly now I do fairs. I go to shows and fairs. And I have my open house, which is coming up. You can all take a card home, which is coming up on next Sunday. I probably left a lot of things out. There's so much. Yes.
You didn't mention, but maybe you didn't want to mention, the dolls.
Oh, those aren't yellowware.
Oh, but they're clay.
Yeah, that's yellow clay too.
Okay.
How durable is the yellowware? You might have said I came in.
No pottery is meant to last forever, otherwise we wouldn't have any jobs.
Blame obsolescence.
So yeah, nothing lasts forever. It's more durable than redware because it's harder. It's the whole idea. Clay is actually weathered feldspar, which is actually decomposed granite. So you're melting this decomposed, broken down material back into rock. Feldspar is usually a white or a light color until it gets contaminated by iron. And iron melts at a very low temperature. So if you fire red clay higher, thinking that you're going to make a harder pot, it will not turn out that way. It'll start to warp and bend, and it will never hold the glaze. It'll get misshapen, and so it's really not usable. And actually, for baking, you don't want something that hard. The porous material is actually better for baking. So you don't want anything hard as a rock. So it's not going to last forever. It's harder.
Unless you leave it on the shelf and
No,
enjoy
you
it.
could use it. You could use it. And I use it even though it's cracked. I bring on all the rejects into my house, so I use the cracked ones. I had a pie plate once that had a crack in it that split in the oven, but that doesn't usually happen.
Reggie, when you said bending and warping or whatever, it reminded me a little bit of another type of pottery, hand building. Did you ever do any hand building, or is that a whole different? I mean, it's obviously a whole different.
Well, yeah, I've done a lot of hand building, but tonight we're talking
Oh,
about
I know,
yellowware.
let me just.
And actually, they did not do a lot of hand building with yellowware. It was never
Uh-huh.
hand building. And the very early English pots, it's hard to say. They actually look like they were formed on a wheel. The thing is, the Chinese are way ahead of us. They've always been way ahead of us. And the Chinese pots were, their glazes, their shape, their form is so much more refined than anywhere else. And the pagans in England and the Germans were they just wanted to make crude stuff. You know, they really weren't into making art pottery. And so it didn't really happen until maybe the 1600s, somewhere in there. And it's really hard to figure out when it happened, because you're talking about the 1200s, like post-medieval. You don't really know what happened with their potters because they didn't have photographs. There's not a lot of drawings. You could see them working on wheels. You could see sometimes they're forming things with their hands. But there's not a lot of records left. And the pottery that we have left, the shards, it's almost like a missing link. You have this really crude stuff, and then you have this refined stuff. So it's really hard to define when they jumped over into making artistic pottery. Which is really very interesting, and there's reasons for that. When you think about what they needed pottery for, like I said, originally they needed to cook and bake and store in, and somewhere in there in the 1600s, the roads were improving, so transportation was better, commerce was better, people were taking things into town. Originally, if you were a potter, you would make stuff and you'd sell it to your neighbors, and they couldn't go anywhere else. So they bought your stuff and they used your stuff, but then when people started getting around better, the roads were better, you could take things off to London and try to sell them there, and then they had to be more desirable. People, started decorating their pots, and that's when they first started putting the bands on, these decorative bands, and these splotches. It was decorative because before that they were just making really boring, plain pottery, either with red or yellow or white clay, with no decorations. So they wanted to make it look more desirable.
So Reggie, how long does it say that big pot, the big one with the cover on it? How long does it take you to make something like that?
Well, it's really fast on the wheel. It takes maybe 10, 15 minutes to make it, but everything else takes so much longer because you have to let it sit around and dry, and you have to babysit it. Pots tend to dry on the top before they do the bottom, because the bottom's down here near the table or the base, and it doesn't dry as well. So you have to keep an eye on it. If the pot dries too fast on the top, you have to cover it up and make sure that it's dry evenly. And then you have to turn it over and trim it. If it's too hard and you go to try to trim it, that's when it's going to break. It's really fragile. This one here has not been fired at all yet, and it's very, very brittle. So you have to get it before you decorate it. And then it has to dry some more. Usually I wait 2 or 3 weeks to make sure it's sort of dry. It's never completely dry because clay absorbs moisture from the air. So when you put it in the kiln, you leave the kiln open for a couple hours for that moisture to evaporate. If you shut your kiln up right away and you've got a damp pot in there, it's going to explode. And it's just going to be like the rock. It's going to take everything else with it. And you will hear this great big bang. And that's happened occasionally. So after it's been fired for 8 to 10 hours and cooled for 8 to 10 hours, you have to glaze it. And so the whole process, it probably takes about an hour from start to finish. And that's if you don't dig up your own clay. That's going to be a lot longer.
And get the sticks out of it.
Which is funny because people always say, well, why don't you dig your own clay? And you're like, it's already taking forever.
Are there any sources around here?
sources for clay?
Yes.
Well, actually, I get my red clay, which I don't have any here because I'm doing yellowware tonight. But the red clay I get from Sheffield.
No,
and
I meant to dig up.
To dig up?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I went up to Dog Pond and I got some. So there is a lot of, and we joke about your lake up there. Tyler Lake is going to someday, all the cottages are going to slide down into the lake because it's all clay up in there. So there's clay all over the place. It's just, you don't want to just start digging up your yard looking for it. Every town around here has a brickyard. And in the very beginning, when people first landed in the 1600s, they just started digging up that clay to make bricks. So there are brickyards everywhere. And Torrington they had at least 5 that I know of. So there's clay still there. It's still there. But there's usually houses on it now.
Excuse me, man, can I dig in your
So
backyard?
do you have some in your yard?
No.
No? And a lot of times it's not clean. Even if you're making bricks, you want a good clean clay. Bricks are tempered with a lot of sand, so they don't have to be a good quality clay as if you were going to make a pot out of it. But you still want to get it, as clean as you can for those annoying popping reasons.
If you can't tell from looking at the raw clay whether it's yellow or red or whatever, then how do you know how you're going to fire it? I think you said that each one fires at a different temperature.
Well, if you go out in your yard and just dig up some clay, like the kids from New York, I'm just going to put it in the kiln at a low temperature. If you put it in the kiln at redware temperature is going to be anywhere from 1,000 to 1,700 degrees, so it's very low considering for pottery. So in that time it's going to turn red. I'll almost guarantee it's going to be red. So if it's not red, if it's more of a buff color or even pink, then you know it's a stoneware clay and you could fire it higher and see what it does.
So you can open it during the process?
No, you have to
Oh.
wait a couple days. So you would just try it out. And actually people made test kilns. All you really have to do for a test kiln is have a pot that you turn upside down and you can actually make a kiln out of that. It just takes a long time. So nowadays, instead of going through all that, you would just put a sample in with your other pots, see what happens. Sometimes I have trouble with my red and yellow clay because you can see these two look an awful lot alike. When they're wet, this one's actually a little bit darker, but not a lot. I don't do it so much. I don't make the mistake of firing it wrong on bigger pots, but a lot of the minis sometimes I won't. I'll get them mixed up because they're really close. But it's not as critical. But you don't usually mess up on that. You know what you're doing with the clay.
But am I hearing you correctly? You're saying that if you didn't know, like somebody gave you some clay and you weren't sure what it was, you can fire it, cool it down, and then fire it again to a higher
Yes,
temperature?
you can refire things. And actually I have an example of that in my kiln right now. My kiln did not shut off yesterday. It's a broken switch. It gets up to 2,300 degrees and things melt down, they wear out, and the switch has broken. So it did not fire and I get up. You could tell what temperature it is after a while just by looking at the heat. And when it's lower, it's red, and then it gets up to orange and yellow and then white, but never going to get up to white. But it will get up to orange and yellow in my kiln, and I could tell that it hasn't fired, and I know how long it's taking to fire. So and I fire it at night. So yesterday I opened the kiln. I went in there in the morning, and you have little peepholes that you could check, and it was still bright red, and I just it's not going. So you have to shut it off, cool it down, and open it up and see what's wrong. But it's just a simple switch. So tomorrow I will get a new switch, fix the switch, And then at that point, the clay is actually hard. It's pink right now. It's not this yellow color because it's very low. It's kind of a pink, and it's like a salmon pink, and it's very, very soft and brittle still. So, and you could tell just by looking at it how far it's gone and or not gone. So when I fix the switch, I'll just crank it up to higher. And it won't take as long. It won't take the 7 hours, 8 hours. I'll probably do it in maybe 5 or 6. And it'll be okay. Sometimes you can't fix things. If it overfires, you can't. And that's happened too. Any more questions? You know, we've gotten way off the subject. There's just so many variations of clay and the glazes and the colors, and you know, it's just impossible to describe it all. And I brought in some extra books. I've got my Flow Blue, which is actually an earthenware clay underneath there. And I've got there's a buffalo pottery out there. I love the drawings on that one. And we actually did some face jugs in New England. I was down south at South Carolina Fair, and everybody comes up to tell me about Dave the Potter, Dave the Slave. There was a very famous potter, he was a slave, and he would write verses on his pottery, and he would sign them, which is a thing that most potters didn't do. Herbie Brooks from Goshen signed his pottery, but most potters did not sign their pottery. So Dave signed all his pots, and he did a lot of face jugs, and he did these wonderful little Bible verses on them, signed his name. His pots are worth a lot of money now. But we did actually have some potters up here in New England that made face jugs. And everybody does at one point or the other because it's a fun thing to do.
And did you?
What's that?
Have you?
Oh, yes. Yes, face jugs are great. So there's some pottery here. This one over here is from, this is the Southern pottery. And I got to see I was at the Appalachia Homecoming in Tennessee in the first week of October, and they had the largest known pottery jug made in America, and it was on my Facebook page. It holds 750 gallons, and it weighs about 3,000 pounds. So I figure it took about 6,400 pounds of clay to make it. And it's about this tall. It's about this round. I could actually fit in it.
Very
And
big.
it was used at the Eastman Kodak Company.
So I take it from the reference that you make to the books that pottery can be very regional in terms of style or objects, different types of things that the potter might be involved with. Is that true? Is it kind of a regional?
Which one?
You mentioned different books. You mentioned Appalachia. You mentioned various places you've been.
Yeah, sometimes potters got creative, and Flow Blue is actually an accident. They, I think it's something ammonia, something that they accidentally put in the kiln, and it made the blue bleed because you know the transfers, the blue willow patterns, that kind of thing, and they're very crisp. They're actually printed on. They're not decals like we do now. They're cobalt blue and usually some kind of oil, and it's printed on a metal drum like they used to do printing. And then it's put onto tissue paper and transferred to the pot. So it comes out in a nice crisp line, except for if you put, I think it's ammonia that you put in the kiln, and it will make everything bleed. And somebody did it by accident and said, "Ooh, look at this!" And so it became their whole thing, this Flow Blue. And the Delarm plate is actually very interesting because that was another accident. They had their pottery building was 2 or 3 floors high, and they had taken some pottery out of the kiln and it was still hot, and they had taken it up to the 2nd or 3rd floor, and it was cooler up there. and because it was cooler, their glaze crackled. And I don't know if you know Delarm pottery, and I didn't bring any samples in. It's the old pottery with the little bunnies that run around the edge. And so their glaze all crackled, and then they took lampblack and rubbed it into the cracks, and there was a big hit. So
Have
that's
you-
another accident.
Have you ever done anything by oxygen reduction?
No, and I can't because I don't have, I have an electric kiln, so it's always an oxidized atmosphere. It's a very stagnant, controlled atmosphere in the kiln. If you use any kind of carbonous material, oils or wood or gas, it's going to have a whole different effect on your pottery. But if you, and some people have put oil rags in their electric kilns, and it will have an effect on it, and it has this wonderful, interesting effect because one side of your pottery will have blotches on it, and it just comes out really interesting. But the trouble is it ruins your elements. So then you end up spending a lot of money on elements, the heating coils. So it's not a good idea to do. Occasionally the kids will put newspaper in there, but that's not too bad.
What does that have to do with the pottery that you collect?
That's the way it's
Oh.
carved.
When did you say your open house is? Is it next weekend?
It's the 20th,
The 20th.
the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Okay.
Primitive.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And,
Thank
if
you.
you have any
Any
more
more stuff?
questions, you can